Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. And today I'm joined by Gregory J. Feist, who is an American psychologist and professor of psychology at San Jose State University. He has published in the psychology of creativity, personality, psychology of science, motivated reasoning, and the development of scientific talent. Today's topic is creativity, which we're going to explore from the unique perspective of how to boost happiness through creativity. Let's learn together. And hi again, Gregory. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored by the invitation, and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah. And as I said before, we are based in Melbourne. You're in the US, and it's a different time zone.
Yes.
While, it's evening there, it's Monday. It's morning here. It's not Monday. My brain completely goes, it's Monday. No, it's not. But yeah, it's a different time zone, and I'm glad we can make it happen.
Yes. Yeah, I'm on the West Coast. I'm in the Bay Area of San Francisco, really. So, yeah.
Yeah. So we are very thrilled that today we are going to be talking about creativity, which is one of your many expertise areas. But before we start, even though I've shared with the audience your bio, we always love to invite our guests to share a bit more about themselves so we get to know you more. Maybe you have some fun facts, maybe a story about yourself that you would like to share with our audience.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the simple, fairly short version of all of this is that, first of all, I should say that my father was a professor of psychology, and I ended up taking a class from him. Although at the time I was really I started off in philosophy, and that's actually how I ultimately came to psychology, though, because I was interested in philosophical questions as an undergraduate. So I started off majoring in philosophy. And then I realized, I really want to answer questions with data and not just ask questions, which philosophers are very good at. And I enjoy that, and I still enjoy it, but I wanted to have answers. And so I was more attracted to the scientific side of psychology. So yeah, but I've been interested in creativity for some reason since I was in high school. I mean, going all the way back then, I just was fascinated by people who solve problems, did things uniquely, changed the world. The big people in culture who really do change the world. And I was always curious, why? What is it about some people that allow them to think differently, to solve problems in a unique and creative way? So that's been my lifelong, interest and even obsession almost. I mean, I've that's the one constant for 30 years or so or more that I've been interested in. So that's kind of how I got into psychology anyway, and creativity.
Yeah, so it runs in the family pretty much.
It does run in the family.
Yeah.
Right. And I guess I should also say that I'm also I teach introduction to psychology, and I'm a textbook author, and so I really enjoy that's my philosophical background. I enjoy still keeping in touch with the entire field. So I now know a lot more about the whole field than I would have if I weren't both teaching and then writing an introductory book.
Yeah. So you've created textbooks, which
Yeah.
which means that, a lot of the materials being taught must have come from, some of them must have come from you. And so you have a lot of insights that I'm sure you can share with us today. And I'm excited about that. I think it's interesting because I tell all my guests, I've was really interested in psychology, but one thing I haven't mentioned on this show before is I'm from Vietnam, and where I'm from, psychology is not something
Right.
that makes sense to a lot of people. Especially in a country like ours, it's kind of interesting when you think about what profession you go for. And then it's just kind of like, why would you go into psychology? There's no money there,
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think
Well,
yeah, sorry.
yeah. Well, I was going to say, San Jose in the Bay Area, and San Jose State in particular, has a very big Vietnamese population. And in fact, I would say probably 20-30% of my students are from Vietnam. And I've had conversations with them about exactly that.
Yeah.
Their families don't understand why they're not going into engineering or medicine,
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
And they don't understand psychology. And it's like, okay, well, it's about human nature.
Yeah.
Human behavior.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I haven't mentioned that before, but I heard your story and I was just thinking, like that's really incredible. And it's an honor and definitely a privilege to be able to learn from you directly today as you created the textbook. I never got into psychology, from my education. Maybe I will in the future. I haven't yet, but, to be able to learn from the insights from someone who actually teaches and write textbook is rare. And so I'm excited about that. We're going to unpack that a bit more for sure.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the really nice introduction. And we've got to know how you got into psychology, why you're doing what you're doing. But on this show, we have a section at the very beginning where we actually ask our guests for some recommendation so that our audience can get to know you better. And we call that section, Have You Met Gregory? So are you ready?
Yes, sure.
Okay, let's do it. The first question, I love this one because I'm a big book reader. Like I love reading books and I loved hearing recommendations from our guests. So what is a book you would recommend?
Well, one of the books that kind of changed my life, I guess, and so I have to go with that, and all the way back when I was a teenager, is someone you may or may not be familiar with. His name is Henry David Thoreau. He was an American 19th century writer, and his famous book was called On Walden Pond. And he talked about why he went to live in the woods, to live a simple life. And he had this phrase, he had this one little saying that still has stuck with me and is maybe one of the things we'll talk about at the end, because I'm now starting to write a book on this, which is that, we're only here for a little while. What he said basically is, I'm going to go live in the woods and live the simplest life I can because I want to confront life at its fullest. And then when I come to die, make sure that I lived a full life and I don't have any real regrets.
Yeah.
So it was a very kind of existential thing of like seen as and for me, I was 16 years old when I read this, and it was like, wow, that's what it's really about. Is like we do have a limited amount of time here, and we want to do something meaningful and creative with our life and have an impact if we can.
Yeah.
And so that book really had an impact on me that way, because it kind of opened my eyes to like, okay. And then a little bit later, I was an exchange student in Germany in my senior year of high school, and I had this kind of epiphany. I think it was kind of related to that book, which is, wow, I never thought this before, even though my dad was a professor. I never thought that. And I all of a sudden realized, wow, my calling is being a professor. This is what I want to do.
Yeah.
This is what, and I want to write and I want to create and I want to do research. And so anyway, so that book was really very foundational and fundamental for my interest.
Yeah. So I have heard of the author for sure, but I have actually not read the book yet. So definitely we'll have to put that on my list.
Okay.
And yeah, it's inspiring to hear that you started your journey and the foundation of that is based on this book, this one book. Because
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know it at the time, but I guess that's the way it happened. Yeah.
Yeah. I read a lot, but I haven't found like the one book that I always go about recommending to people. Like I recommend different books. But I guess that's nice because when you
Right.
find the one book
Right.
that you really love reading again and again, that shows that it can signpost you to maybe the next thing that you want to do or the thing that you truly want to create with your
Right.
life
Right.
purpose in a way. So yeah.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, that's both a segue into, and so the other book, and it's
Yeah.
also a movie, because I think that's going to be the next question,
Yes,
which is,
exactly. You're ahead of us.
well, it's the same one. It's Sophie's Choice.
Oh,
If you're familiar with that.
yes.
William Styron's book, Sophie's Choice,
Yeah.
and then Meryl Streep I guess this came out like in the mid 80s, early 80s.
Mm,
It's still to this day one of the most amazing cinematic performances, I think, of all time.
mm,
Um, and it's just such a gripping and unbelievably tragic story
yeah.
of a mother having to make a choice, which I won't get into.
Yes. No spoilers. Yeah.
But just it's really an amazing story of humanity and inhumanity at the same
Yeah.
time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Another classic. The trend today is our guests have been suggesting all the classics, and the same thing I've been saying is it is a classic, and I've heard of it, but I have not watched it. So I am going to watch it. So thank you for that. The third question we have is you mentioned earlier that you do listen to podcasts. So I wonder which one is your favorite beside this one.
Well, there's two that I listen to very regularly, and one pretty much every day, and they're both actually from the New York Times.
Yeah.
One's called The Daily.
Yeah.
And with Michael Barbaro as one of the main people, and and I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's basically a very topical, political, cultural daily podcast. It really is every day, and they get into the kind of one of the main one or two major stories of the day.
Yeah.
And they go into it in about 25 minutes, and it's they always have some expert, insightful person on, and again, it's only about 25 minutes. And then the other one is Ezra Klein, which is much more detailed. The Ezra Klein Show. It's also through the New York Times. But he goes into much more depth. It's kind of a similar thing. It's often about politics or technology or science or literature or, all these things, or economics. I learned more about cryptocurrency than I ever knew because I don't know much about it through Ezra Klein. Anyway, those are two of my favorite podcasts.
Yeah. I think that's those are really good recommendations. I think the Daily, we have a similar version of that in Australia. I'm not sure what it's called. Maybe ABC News Daily or another thing. Maybe called the Daily
Wow.
too. But
Wow.
yeah, I saw that briefly the other day, and I'm not into news that much, but something similar to that I really like is the Conversations by ABC. That's
Okay.
that's quite engaging, and you kind of
Right.
you hear perspectives, and it comes from everyday people. I would say not everyday people. Some of them are experts, but still, it's quite interesting.
And then one of my guilty pleasures is serial killing podcast.
Oh, true crime.
True crime.
Yeah.
Say I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah.
Like I'm not the only one, but
yeah. Oh no, definitely, you're not the only one. I remember in our company we have all hands fortnightly, and I think every 2 weeks we would have a thread about true crime podcast and TV shows, because I think at least half of our team is interested in that. So they can be buddies with you for sure in that area. Yeah.
Well, so I'm into both ends of the human spectrum, creativity and
pretty much. Yeah. Cool. So next one I want to ask you is, I'm sure you have a role model, maybe a famous one, or if not, your personal role model, maybe in your family or in your circles.
Well, the first one that came to mind was going back again to actually I just started college way back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And this famous science communicator, astrophysicist, Carl Sagan, who was one of the big communicators of science, and then he famously did Cosmos, this series that was on PBS, 13 weeks of Cosmos, and he just had this amazing capacity to just be awe-inspiring about the vastness of the universe and what we know about it and what we don't know about it and how we've come to know about the entire universe. And he was also just a very charismatic speaker. And he spoke really well, eloquently, impassioned. And I was like, wow, that would be so cool to be able to do something like that, to go on a, have a show where you inspire people about your science.
Yeah.
I've always been inspired by that. And
Yeah.
one of my fantasies was to do something like that for psychology. Hasn't
Oh,
happened yet. Maybe it will.
yeah. Like we've only talked about the topics and yourself for 15 minutes, but I'm pretty sure you can make that happen. I believe that you can make that show happen. I'm going to keep my eyes peeled for that.
Yeah, well, we'll see. It's still in the back of my mind. It still is in the back of my mind.
Yeah, you gotta do it. If it's calling you, you gotta do it. I'm sure you can. Yeah. Great. So finally, I know you teach a lot, and you, in fact, just gave exams to your students today. But I wonder, in recent years, if you've taken any courses for yourself, if you've learned any new skills or picked up new things recently.
Yeah. The only thing I can say is I teach graduate statistics, and this is a nerdy thing that there's a program for statistical analysis that's open source, but I didn't know because it wasn't around when I was in graduate school. It's called R, and so I'm right here in the middle of Silicon Valley, and so a lot of our students go from our master's program into jobs at Google and Intel and Facebook and so on because they're right here, and they don't use this other program called SPSS anyway. Yeah. So I as someone who teaches it, I had to retrain myself, late in my career to learn this entire new statistical thing. So I took this class, and it was hard, but it was really satisfying because I realized, wow, it really teaches you how to think because it's kind of, it's basically programming, and it's very systematic and you just have to be very precise and systematic. And I actually enjoyed that. It's quite different from thinking broadly and creatively. It's like, okay, here, just solve this very specific problem.
Yeah. That caught me by surprise.
No, you wouldn't. Yeah, it's a little nerdy, as I said, but I did that on sabbatical. I had a sabbatical, and I realized I had to be retrained in that.
I think it's a nice thing to hear from a professor, though, because we definitely have seen professors that still teach old things. I'm sure some of us might have encountered that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's exactly right. And especially in statistics, most psychologists tend to only know the statistics they learned in graduate school. So if they're 50 years old, 60 years old, that's 40 years ago. And they don't learn anything new. And I realized, that's not the way to teach this. I've got to keep up with the current stuff. And so, that's why I went into being a professor, because I love learning. And I don't want to just teach the same way I taught, 20 years ago.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. I think it's inspiring to hear that from a professor, and that might, reignite the love of learning in some of our audience for sure. Because a lot of people are kind of saying, don't really want to go to uni or learn something new because the stuff they teach, la, la, la. And I think this is good to hear straight from a professor.
Well, I tell you, I mean, I realized, and I took for granted that I just love learning new stuff. And I really get these little dopamine hits, as it were, if you're familiar, it really excites me every time I learn something new. And that's what I love about writing the intro psych book, because I have to constantly keep up with all the newest research and I get excited about this, and I forget that, most of my students actually don't love learning the same way I do. They're just trying to get through it, but I try to inspire them.
Yeah.
And the best teaching works when you inspire the love of learning.
Yeah, for sure. Students. Yeah, for sure. That's what we need more. And, that's what we're trying to achieve here at LMSL, I would say, because these topics, for example, the topics that we're going to talk about today in the context of our show, we talk about happiness on the weekly, and today's topic, we talk about creativity. These things are not new concepts, but there are new
Right.
ways of looking at them, and it takes someone who's willing to learn, who's constantly on the lookout for new insights, to actually maybe click on this podcast in the first place or think about these topics. Because
Right.
a lot of people are kind of taking it for granted and say there's nothing new for me to learn there, I know it all. So that's why we're here, that's why we're doing this. And that leads me to our official part of this podcast, where we talk about happiness, creativity, and how to boost our happiness through creativity. And the first question we always ask, because it's the show, is how would you define happiness personally?
Well, so even though I've studied creativity a long time, actually one of the other topics in my graduate school training was emotion. So I studied emotion as well, and well-being, subjective and psychological well-being. So my simple answer here is that happiness is a very broad, complicated concept in psychology, because it's both a short-term emotion and it's a long-term trait, and it's a long-term mood. And in terms of emotions in general, by the way, let me just start off with that. Emotions, typically are very short-lived. They're only a few seconds to maybe a few minutes, literally. It's hard to be really angry or really happy or really sad. Well, sad's a little bit different, of course, or disgusted or whatever. These basic emotions are pretty ephemeral for the most part. So when we talk about happiness, though, what we're talking about is, so like one of my professors at Berkeley, who was an emotion researcher, he said that, we experience happiness when essentially something, well, first of all, we experience emotion, I should say, when something meaningful, important has happened. If it's not meaningful to our well-being, we don't experience emotion. So emotion is very telling about what matters to us in our lives in general. So then happiness is essentially experienced when we move toward an important goal in our life. We've done something that matters to us, and we've succeeded in it. Or some event has happened that is very consistent with our values and our beliefs. And so we experience this thing that we call happiness, that's consistent with our goals. Like if I wanted to be a professor or whatever, or I just love learning, and I learn something really cool that makes me happy. It's like, okay, because that's something I value and I believe in. So happiness is when we make this reasonable progress towards a goal in our life, is really what it comes down to. So we'll talk more about this, but I don't want to get too far into the creativity angle, but just to give you an idea, but anger, for instance, it's interesting that why do we experience any emotion? Again, first of all, it has to be important to us, but like the negative emotions, like, are basically when our well-being is either harmed or threatened. So anger is when someone violates some should. Someone does something or some event happens that shouldn't, that we believe should not happen. We experience anger. Sadness, of course, is when we experience loss. So happiness is when we experience movement toward an important goal in our lives.
Yeah.
So that's the...
Yeah. So interesting. I said it's interesting because just before our recording now, in the early morning, we had another recording with yet another expert, and the concept that he brought was quite similar, and the key words that we got from that was meaning and purpose in life. It's about, driving towards that. And I relate to that so hard when you were saying, it's about what you want to achieve. It's kind of like the same thing, similar concepts.
Right. Well, and again, that might be something we come to at the end, because this is a book I'm writing on creativity and meaning, which will...
teaser. Okay.
Teaser.
There's a teaser right there. Okay. That got me excited. Every time I heard a book, I'm like, oh, yes. Great. Okay. So I think there is an overlap between happiness and well-being that you just mentioned. And then again, I talk about this quite often on this show. And in fact, I actually host another show also by LMSL, which is called Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights podcast. And there we actually look into well-being in detail and look at the architecture of the elements that make up well-being. And what I've noticed throughout this learning journey, because I'm no expert, but I've noticed that there's this overlap between happiness and well-being. They're not one. They're definitely two separate areas, but kind of overlapping. And I don't know what it is. I haven't grasped it all yet because I'm still at the very beginning of learning about these things. But I've noticed, as you said, there's that element of well-being within happiness and vice versa. It's very interesting to kind of navigate that dynamic. Yeah.
Well, and so, if I could say something, because that's interesting, because that's exactly how psychologists think about it, which is that happiness is kind of the short-term, emotion.
Yeah.
But well-being is broader. Well-being is more of an evaluation of our entire life. So and I've done a little bit of research in this too, which is subjective well-being and life satisfaction.
Yeah.
Which are related to happiness for sure. But happiness, the way most psychologists who study this think about it, is happiness is, again, more the affective part.
Yeah.
And well-being is a little bit more, it has an affective component to it for sure, but it's also has a cognitive evaluation.
Yeah.
Like, am I doing well in life? That's also life satisfaction. Am I satisfied with the life I've led? Kind of like what I was saying with Thoreau earlier.
Yeah.
Like looking back, whenever it is our time comes to leave this world, are we going to look back and see and be, content with the life we've led?
Yeah.
So life satisfaction is that on an ongoing basis. Like, how am I doing okay? So it's both cognitive and affective.
Yeah.
So it's broader than just the kind of emotional component of happiness. So
Absolutely.
I guess another way to say that is that happiness is kind of a subset, really, of well-being.
Yeah. That is something to think about for sure. It's very interesting because, as I said, I'm still learning about this. And if you said it's a subset, then we need to look at our whole architecture again, because initially I was like, oh, maybe there's an overlap, because I've seen so much overlap between the two. And I'm kind of like mapping in my brain, like, oh, okay, this and that. And they're kind of the same, but not really. And then, and it's kind of
They're
like.
definitely related. Yeah, they're definitely related.
Yeah. So it's going to take time to map that out. But that's very interesting to take note of for sure. I guess it's in the context of this show, because we're talking about happiness, I would like to bring our attention to some of the misconceptions. Because we've discussed the definition, we've discussed how it's related or, can be identified within or with the presence of well-being. I also think that a lot of us, humans in general, we might get wrong ideas when it comes to happiness. And I'm sure you've noticed quite a few of them. So I would love to hear from your perspective, what are the biggest ones you've noticed?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones I've noticed is kind of what we were just saying, in a sense, which is that happiness in the way that really matters anyway, I guess, is more than just an emotion.
Yeah.
It's not just this short-term emotion, which is literally, when you're happy, when you're literally in the state of happiness, it generally only lasts a few minutes, maybe sometimes even less.
Yeah.
So when we talk about happiness in the way that matters, we're really talking about it in terms of and that's, I think, one reason why psychologists use the word satisfaction and well-being, because it's broader than that. So I think that's one of the misconceptions people have is and the second one is that people sometimes, I think, mistakenly think that being happy is a goal in itself. And I don't agree with that. I actually think that happiness is a byproduct of living well, rather than a goal in itself.
Yeah.
So if you are living a fulfilling, meaningful life, you will be relatively happy. So it's better, so the thing to do is search for meaning and fulfillment, and happiness follows.
Yeah.
But some people think, I just want to be happy. And they aim for happiness, but then that's kind of leaving out, happiness, what do you mean by happiness? How do you get there? And get there by living a meaningful, fulfilled life, really.
Yeah.
And so happiness kind of takes care of itself, I think.
Yeah,
is
for
the way
sure. For sure. Yeah. As I said, we just had a very similar discussion. It's not the exact same. Like I think the way you phrase that um, kind of sparked some ideas in me, which I'll share. But I think the key takeaway from this is not about chasing happiness, whatever that might mean to each of us, but it's more so living um, towards achieving your life goals, life purpose, whatever that might mean. And we also have multiple purposes in life. That's what I've learned just this morning. Just not It's not one thing. We can be multiple things, and we can aim to achieve multiple things. It's not just that one thing that you're kind of thinking about. And it's I think this is reaffirmation for a lot of people, because um, I think especially in the age of social media, which I talk about quite a bit on the show, is everyone
Right.
is everyone is happy on their highlights, on their post, on their whatever it is that they showcase, while in fact we're just all on the same journey.
And as you know, I mean, wow, that's a huge can of worms right there.
Yeah, pretty much.
That because the social media happiness is really quite fake and performative. Uh, really for most people, it's it's wanting to show happiness, but
Yeah,
in fact, it's actually led to a lot of unhappiness and anxiety and
exactly.
depression,
Yeah,
especially in people,
yeah.
because because of exactly that. They look at everyone else supposedly being happy, and they say, "Damn, my life sucks in comparison."
Yeah.
And so, but of course, that's all fake too. That's not real. I mean, it's what people want to present, and again, performative rather
Yeah.
than real. So anyway,
Yeah, that's a
and
different area for
that's
sure.
just girl, but
Yeah.
that's a big
Yeah.
one though. It's
Yeah, it
huge.
is. It is. But I do like the fact that you mentioned happiness should be a byproduct, because, when you're living your true purpose and doing what you want and having a flourishing life, happiness will come naturally.
Right,
And,
right.
I know that social media is a can of worm in itself, but what I have to say is, and it's related to this topic, is creativity. I get so much inspiration from social media when it comes to creativity.
Right.
And I know that not everything looks as perfect as it is on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube,
Yeah.
but let's be real, those people that are showcasing their creativity and they're living their best lives thanks to their profession. Maybe they experience burnout, maybe they experience self-doubt, but they are actually doing what they believe in, and they inspire
Right,
me. And I think
right.
in a way they found part of their happiness, or they definitely feel that happiness in their lives.
Well, right.
So that leads me to my question, that is related to your expertise area, which is, how would you define creativity? Because it might mean different thing. I just listed a couple of things that I noticed, but it might
Yeah.
be so much
Right.
more.
Right. Well, let me, okay, if I can I throw that back at you for a second? Because I always
Oh
like to
yeah,
get it. I do this all the time with my students.
for sure.
Is what is your understanding of creativity? How would
Um,
you define?
Yeah. Oh, thank you for asking. I get to stop being a host for a second. This is from when I was a child. And for me, I don't think creativity is necessarily art only. To
Right.
me, it is the ability to make something out of nothing, or the ability to create a new way of doing things. Because to me, I cannot, for example, I cannot draw. I suck at
Yeah.
drawing. I
Right.
cannot
Right.
paint.
Right.
I suck at painting. I cannot write songs, but
Right.
I can solve problems. And that's my way of showcasing my
Right.
creativity.
Right. 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 Yeah. And so, yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's without a doubt a big part of creativity. But as it turns out, it's only a part.
Mm,
And this is
interesting.
why.
Yep.
Well, because everyone talks about, thinking outside the box, doing something original, doing something novel. And that is definitely, the essence of creativity.
Yep.
But it's not enough. It's kind of necessary, but not sufficient.
Mm,
And the reason it's not sufficient is very easy to demonstrate, which is, and this is what I do in my class and so on when I talk about creativity.
yeah.
Um, you know, um, People who are schizophrenic suffer from schizophrenia, speak in what psychologists and psychiatrists call word salad. It's kind of very disorganized, uh, um, incoherent speech, basically. It's like just throwing words together, and each word kind of means something, but together they don't really mean much. So that's very original. That's very different.
Yeah.
That's very novel,
Yeah.
but it's not very meaningful.
Okay.
And so you really have to add the second criterion for creativity. And everyone who studies it pretty much says this. Some people say there's three things, but most people say there's two.
Yeah.
Which is originality, novelty is one. Mm-hmm. But then what I call meaningful or useful or adaptive solutions is another. So in other words, you know, and I show this cartoon actually that just came up. This woman in the cartoon is putting her hair in a blender.
Okay.
and cutting her hair that way.
Wow.
And she's saying to her father, look how creative I am. and the little subheading says, sometimes it's not good to think outside the box. And then one of my favorite philosophers, actually, Immanuel Kant, said once, there can be original nonsense. So originality in and of itself, being different just to be different, is not enough.
Yeah,
it really isn't. You know, so you have to have a novel, original solution that matters, that means something, that is a useful, adaptive solution to an important problem. So when you do that, when you add both of those, then you have creativity. The novelty and originality by itself is, again, because, you know, and sometimes young people tend to think, you know, when they're going through their teen years and trying to find themselves, and they want to dress very different or behave very different because, you know, that's what they do. And they think that's creative. I was like, well, not really. I mean, you know, just being different is not creative.
That is true.
It might be. Yeah. But you also have to do something that's meaningful in a different way. Anyway, so that's really the essence of creativity. And then the other thing that I would say is that people like myself who study this for now 10 or 15 years, this has been out there in the literature, and I find it very useful, is that we have to talk about different levels of creativity. Creativity is not creativity is not creativity. There's kind of personal creativity where it's creative to me. It's like a new and novel and useful solution, but only to me. Other people have already figured this out or done it, but I'm just discovering it for the first time. So it's creative to me. Yeah. So that's what psychologists call mini creativity, mini C. That's kind of the lowest level. And then there's small creativity, small C creativity, which is when someone is, let's say, an artist or a writer or a musician or a photographer or even a scientist or whatever, work in tech, and they do work that gets some notoriety, but kind of regionally. It doesn't go, you know, it doesn't have an impact on the field yet. It's kind of like let's say an artist is finally getting their work posted at the local coffee house. Okay, that's something. That's an achievement. That's you know, something that people appreciate, but on a local level. Yeah. And then so that's small C creativity, and then step up from that, we talk about professional C, professional creativity. People who are in the arts and sciences and architecture and business and, you know, and entrepreneurship, and they're being creative at their professions. They are doing creative work. It may or may not, again, have a national or international impact, but they're being creative in their profession. You know, so that's pretty high level creativity. And then at the highest level, we talk about big C creativity. And big C creativity is the people who really change their field, who really make such a significant contribution in whatever domain it is: art, music, literature, dance, science, technology, whatever, again, architecture, sculpture, whatever the field is. But they wow, these are like top of the field. They have a national and often international impact. Like, you know, their field is different after their work. You know, and if you really get even beyond that, you get the kind of the cultural
mega C
change. Yeah. Well, whatever that's interesting. You know, like the true geniuses of the world, the ones who, you know, the Newtons and the Picassos and the Einsteins and the Van Goghs and the people who are talked about for generations and centuries. Yeah. You know, So that's obviously that's a very high bar. So the point is that creativity exists on this continuum
Yeah.
from very personal to very international and, and timeless,
Yeah.
basically.
Wow.
So
Very
that's an important,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Very different from what you hear on the daily. So, this is academics materials right there. If you want to learn more about creativity, definitely look it up. And yeah, if one day there's mega creativity, you got to let us know because
Meg, I like that.
yeah.
Maybe we'll have to add,
Yeah, yeah.
and I'll have to give you credit.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that'll be great. Thank you. Maybe when maybe then I can say I want to get into psychology. I have this tiny credit for the word creativity, mega C. So yeah, yeah,
Right,
that'll be fun.
right.
I think I think that is different for a lot of us because again, I'm not an academic, I'm not an expert, and I guess a lot of people are like myself hearing this for the first time. When it comes to creativity, I guess we want to say that we are creative, each of us. But when we truly look at the definition, we'll see the different levels of impact, and
Right,
that puts
right.
things into perspective.
By the way, yeah, let me say something because the other thing you said, which is very important because it's also very common, which is the false belief, really, that creativity is really art and something in the arts.
Yeah.
Arts defined broadly.
Yeah.
But of course, that's simply. I mean, that's clearly a major component and domain for creativity for sure. But, try to be a scientist. And if you're not creative, you're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
That absolutely requires that you think outside the box, that you solve problems that no one else has solved before. Again, business consistently, all the modern, new technology that we have, again, especially here in Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
these are innovators that have changed the world. So they've thought differently about things in a useful and applied and meaningful way.
Yeah.
So it's just simply a myth to think that creativity, I'm not creative because I don't draw or paint or sing or write
Yeah.
or dance. It's
Yeah,
like, okay,
true.
well, but there's about a million other domains you can be creative in.
That's true. Yeah, I think it helps, right? Because a lot of people are saying, and I've heard this quite a bit, I'm not creative. And I think that's not
Right.
true.
Well, what they mean is I'm not artistic.
Yeah, exactly. It's different from creative.
Yeah.
I truly
Yeah.
think that every single person on this planet is creative in their own way. It's just
Right.
which domain it is
Yeah.
and which C it is. Is it tiny
Exactly. No, I was going to say
or
exactly. It's
mini?
both.
Sorry, mini or mega? That's a
Linear
whole
and-
different thing. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like being an athlete, everyone can play a sport or whatever,
yeah,
and everyone can get better with training and practice and discipline. But not everyone's going to necessarily be world class at it.
yeah.
And so not everyone's going to be a Picasso or a Van Gogh or an Einstein, but
Yeah.
everyone can be creative.
Yeah,
And everyone is
absolutely.
creative. I agree.
Yeah.
It just depends on what domain and to what extent and how much effort you put into it and how important it is in your life.
Yeah, for sure. I think this might also sound a bit nerdy, but I love The Big Bang Theory. I've watched it about
Right.
5 times, and I'm just like in awe every single time I rewatch it. I'm just like, whoa, whoa, whoa! That's really creative. That's amazing. This is originality. This is how passionate they are about their work, and I guess that is the kind of creativity that's often overlooked. Because as you said, some people are like, I'm not creative. Well, yes, you're not artistic. That's
Right.
different.
Yeah.
And there's a whole
Right.
other world out there with all these scientists,
Yep.
innovators, and people that are making things happen. And it's so cool,
Well,
to be honest.
not to mention everyday creativity. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes the most creative people are the ones who are just surviving on limited needs.
Yeah.
That's super creative.
Yeah.
To feed a family of 4 when you're hardly making any money, you got to have figured things out.
Yeah.
That's creativity.
Absolutely. So true.
So
yeah. Let that
so
sink in
there's-
for a second, Definitely, like, parents need to hear this. Kids need to hear this. Definitely. I think that's very important. I guess, we talked about happiness at the very beginning. We defined it. We talked about some misconceptions. We've covered creativity. And I remember this from before, and I just want to repeat it because I think it's so important, is happiness is a byproduct when you're doing what you're passionate about and when you're living your purpose. Creativity can be one of those. And
Right.
so I don't know how
Right.
to relate this yet, but I would love to hear from you. How would you define the relationship between creativity and happiness?
Well, yeah. So this is also an important and ultimately complicated set of ideas. And fortunately, I've actually both done some research in this myself earlier in my career, and also I've read the literature and so on. But so here's the way I think about it. First of all, so creativity is an insight. Ultimately, it's it could be a set of insights, but it's having some novel, creative, useful, original, and meaningful idea. But there's something that precedes that. There's before, during, and after the creative insight. And different emotions are part of each of those periods. So highly creative people are often unhappy, actually, at the beginning. Because they see problems that other people don't see. They see something that's not working or something that's missing. And so there's some kind of dissatisfaction with either the world or themselves or something, and they see it as a problem. And other people may be, perfectly fine and not even seeing the problem. But so that first before, there's tension, there's unhappiness, there could be curiosity, but there also could be anxiety. It's like, this just doesn't quite work. And then if you work on a problem and you get stuck and it's really hard, which is ultimately all real important creative ideas are solving difficult, not easy problems. So then all of a sudden you have this insight, this aha. Now, it doesn't always work that way. We know sometimes it's a gradual process, but when it happens in an aha way, there's this like tremendous release of emotion often. It's like it's extreme joy and happiness and sometimes wrongly, by the way. So just because you have an insight or an idea doesn't mean it's a good one. It might end up being a false one. It might not end up working. But the insight still, the aha moment is very emotional. And in fact, I came across this quote recently where Einstein actually said about his 1907 general theory of relativity. He said, that was the happiest thought of my life. Okay, so having that idea, he never experienced that kind of happiness before or after.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an extreme case, of course. So the first thing is to understand that, and then after the insight, though, is often pride and satisfaction and maybe joy and less happiness in a sense, but it's these other positive emotions. Which is another thing. So like actually, in fact, I was interviewing for my way back in my dissertation, I interviewed some really creative scientists in California who were members of the National Academy of Sciences, and they were top of their field and everything. Well, anyway, basically what he was saying is that his idea that he had was just extreme satisfaction because he solved this important problem that even his PhD advisor couldn't solve. So it was just this extreme satisfaction and pride ultimately that he had done this, but also it really is true that creative people are both dissatisfied with things, but also positive emotion, feeling good, we know, also facilitates. So a motivator for creativity, ironically, can be dissatisfaction. Like that's the drive. That's, because as Freud actually said, basically, happy people don't fantasize. Unhappy people fantasize. So if you're happy with everything and you don't see any need to change. So really creative people are somewhat dispositionally unhappy on some level as a motivator, but then positive emotion, feeling good, being happy, actually broadens your cognitive scope and makes you think broader. And that's kind of one of the ways that people come up with original ideas is they think broad rather than narrow. So like anxiety, for instance, narrows your attention and happiness broadens your attention. And so being in a good mood, and there's been some experimental research on this, that they manipulate people's mood. They make them happy. They give them unexpectedly like a candy bar or something, and where they have them work on a problem. And people in good moods actually come up with more creative ideas than people who are anxious, are unhappy. So the bottom line is that there's before, during, and after the creative insight, and different emotions are being experienced in different ways. And then so what it really comes down to is happiness can be both a cause and an effect of creativity. So that's kind of the way I think about it too, is it's not this simple idea that being creative creates happiness. Now it can and does, but I'd say it more like what we were talking about earlier. It creates well-being and fulfillment. Especially if you solve an important problem, like Einstein's problem was change the history of physics. I'm sure he was very, not just happy, but that changed his life. And changed,
absolutely.
So being satisfied and alive and fulfilled are common. Like when I did a study also earlier in my career, I asked actual artists and scientists for these 3 different states of what emotions they were experiencing before, during, and after an insight. And both artists and scientists tended to say, first I was unhappy, dissatisfied, I was anxious, I was, unsure. I had this insight, and that was really, I was very happy and amazed or whatever. And then afterwards I felt alive and satisfied, were the kind of the terms that they often used. So emotion is important in the creative process, but it can facilitate it, and it can also hinder it, the creative thinking. And then another thing to say, which is there's a whole field of art therapy, which I thought about. And the reason I bring that up is because the idea behind art therapy is you're taking people who may not necessarily be creative, in fact, just everyday people, but who are struggling with some kind of emotional or psychological turmoil. And you use art, them dancing, singing. And again, these aren't professional musicians or singers or writers or dancers or whatever, but you therapeutically have them engage in these creative activities, and it as a way of coping with their trauma or their anxiety or their depression or whatever it is. And it does lead to, there's a fair amount of research on this, that it does have an effect. Not in every case, but most studies that look at this have found that art therapy, when done well, can really lead to satisfaction and well-being in people who are relatively unhappy. So I think that's something important to point out about how creativity and emotion are related to one another.
Very interesting.
So there's a lot there.
That's the conclusion. There's a lot to be talked about. I think what you meant to say is perhaps not so artistic people. I believe they are creative. It's probably just not artistic, and then they go through art therapy as a stream of creativity, and then that helps them. That's what I understood.
Yeah. Because when you think about it, in fact, actually, this is another thing, and this again is a little bit of a teaser, maybe toward the end, about the book that I'm actually working on right now, which is that there are these existential problems we all have, like whether, again, going back to my own personal experience of trying to find a meaningful calling in life and make sure that I live a fulfilled life, or relationships, or, what happens to us after we die, all these big philosophical, theological questions, and what do I want to do with my time here and to make it meaningful, and so on. And so, creativity is a solution. Creativity is a way of making meaning. And that's ultimately one of my ideas with this book that I'm working on, is that, in a sense, whether you're doing creative art, creative science, creative living, creative business, creative anything, you're making meaning. You're doing something that means something to you, and because that's even a component of the creative process.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, for sure.
You know, so that's really that's kind of critical. That whatever creativity is one of life's great meaning makers.
Yeah.
As it were.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's a big idea right there. I'm excited to read this book.
Well, I got to write it first.
Yeah.
Got to finish it.
Yes, please do. I'm excited. I'll sign up to the mailing list straight after this. So that is interesting when we start to think about the relationship between creativity and happiness. And as you said, there's so much more to be covered. And I guess, a podcast episode will not cover it. There's so much more to learn. But in the context of your work, we have done some research, our team, and we've noticed that you created a functional model of personality and creativity to cluster personality traits most consistently connected to creativity. And in the research, you said that these include cognitive, social, motivational, affective, and clinical categories, which is very, very fascinating. And would you care to please help us elaborate on this?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few things to say there. First of all, my PhD is in this sub area of psychology called personality psychology. So I study human personality. And personality is essentially the qualities and traits and dispositions that make us unique, like introversion, extroversion. Some of us are more introverted, some of us are more extroverted, some of us are more anxious, some of us are more calm. But the better way to think about personality, I think, is as these traits that we have, like friendliness or hostility or introversion or whatever, is that they really change. Well, the way I put it, the functional idea is that it functions to lower our threshold for behaving. So when I say that someone has an anxious personality or a friendly personality or an introverted personality, what I'm really saying is that their threshold for behaving those ways is lower. Okay? So a low threshold means you just do it more readily. You do it more often. You do it more easily. It's a disposition. It's a predisposition to behave in a particular way. And so we only use traits to talk about people who are different on that dimension than other people. Like if you were average on aggression, people wouldn't call you aggressive. They would just say, well, you're just average. But if you're more aggressive than most people, then we start talking about aggression, let's say. So the functional model of personality is really based on that idea, that personality is something and it does something. And what it does is it changes our behaviors, really. So this idea on the functional model came out of this thing called a meta-analysis. And it's a technical term, and I don't need to get into it in any real detail, but a meta-analysis, very simply, is an analysis of analyses. So when a field has been developed well enough, like there has to be a lot of studies, a lot of published peer-reviewed papers on a particular topic. So instead of just reviewing it, in the old days, you used to just read all the literature and come up with a review. So you would just kind of come to your own subjective conclusions about what the literature is saying. Well, a meta-analysis is different. A meta-analysis is taking the entire body of literature on a topic and then quantifying the results, literally like looking at the quantitative results and then pulling those out and then getting an average result from all the published studies on a given topic. So what I did was I looked at the relationship, the 26, 28 papers published on personality and creativity between this was back in the 90s that I published this. And by the way, we just did a follow-up. I just gave a international talk on this the other day. But it's not published yet, but it's a 20-year follow-up.
Yeah.
But this idea was that I synthesized and integrated all the literature on personality and creativity, and I came up with these functional categories.
Yeah.
Okay. After the fact, I didn't know that going in, but when I looked at them all and I realized the cognitive trait category, the biggest predictor of creativity from a personality perspective, like what personality dimension best and most strongly predicts creative behavior and creative thinking, it's hands down this thing called openness to experience.
Yeah.
Now, it's part of the Big Five model of personality. Big Five means there's 5 major dimensions of personality. It is, as we call it, it's the ocean model: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So that's ocean. Okay. Or canoe, if you want to really use that. So openness involves a lot of different sub traits, but it's like curiosity. It's wanting to try new things. It's exploratory, being adventurous, being curious, being open to novel sensory experiences. Like you like to go places, travel, meet new people, try different menu items. So that's what being high in openness is. And as it turns out, people who are creative are very high in that dimension. They're very high in openness. They're not closed, they're open. And so that's what I call it. I call it a cognitive trait because it's a little bit more, and because it also involves thinking flexibly and open about things. Your ideas, you're not closed. Your ideas are kind of all over the place sometimes, but they're also open to all kinds of possibilities.
Yeah.
The social trait is more like introversion, extroversion. Now, as it turns out, highly creative people often, as Virginia Woolf famously said, need a room of their own, a room of one's own. They need time to be alone and reflect and think. So they tend not to be social butterflies, with a lot of people all over. They can do that sometimes, but they also they often need quiet time and reflection. So they tend to be a little bit more introverted on average than less creative people, is that finding. The motivational category has to do with to be creative, especially if you're going to be even professional or big C creative. These fields are very, very competitive. They're very hard to make a living at. Very few artists can actually make a living at their art only.
Yeah.
They almost always do something else. My youngest son, who's 20, just moved to New York a couple of years ago, and he's trying to be an actor. And it's like, well, good luck with that. During a pandemic, no less. He didn't realize that, but it's like, wow, okay. So, you're going to have to probably do something else too, because even successful actors don't make a living all the time from their acting. But you have to be driven. You have to be absolutely driven and intrinsically driven, and meaning you have to get, ideally, intrinsic joy and pleasure from the process. You're not doing it to be famous. You're not doing it to get money. You're not doing it because you want recognition. You're doing it because you love the process. And so that's what a lot of creative people do. They do it just because they enjoy it, not because they're going to get something out of it.
Yeah.
And then lastly, the clinical traits are kind of some of the things that we talked about, like some of these actually trait emotions, like depression and anxiety, that can actually facilitate, ironically, or sometimes if they're too extreme, they inhibit creativity. But if, or bipolar, there's a book, one of my favorite books, actually, it's called Touch with Fire, written by a psychiatrist, who analyzed the connection between bipolar and world famous literature. Like a lot of so I do have this list here, like poets like Coleridge and Dickinson and Hugo and Keats and Robert Lowell and Edgar Allan Poe, and then writers like Faulkner and Emerson and Dickens and Virginia Woolf and Tolstoy. They all probably had bipolar disorder, among others, or Van Gogh, of course, or Handel and Schumann. A lot of these people had affective disorders, and yet they use that affect, that mania, especially the part of bipolar that's the manic phase, is very consistent with creative thinking. Because when you're, it's technically called hypomanic. You're below the full-blown manic phase.
Yeah.
but you have a lot of ideas. That's what being manic is. So like your ideas are flying all over the place, and creative people are like that too.
Yeah.
So people who have the problem is, and this is the big issue with mental illness and creativity, is that if you have too much of any of these things, it's going to really inhibit creativity. So if you have clinical depression or clinical high levels of bipolar or high levels of anxiety, that's going to interfere with creativity. But if you have a little bit of these things, they can actually sometimes spur on or facilitate creativity. So anyway, so that's something that's interesting. It's so bottom line is that these traits, these different traits, this functional model is just simply looking at the idea that our personalities if we have certain personality traits and qualities, it makes creativity more likely.
Yeah. I'm speechless. There's a whole lecture there. There you go. I'm speechless. That is definitely something new to take away from this conversation, at least, because I think from my perspective as someone who's not an expert, who's not studying it rigorously, what I've noticed is sometimes, for example, like you said, bipolar disorder, a lot of people think of it as something that is a really bad thing. But from this conversation, we learned that, some of the biggest characters on this planet have that. And thanks to that, they have even more creativity to deliver all these amazing things that they've done for us. And I guess that puts things into perspective for a lot of people. And it's the first time that we've heard this for a lot of us, for sure. I've never heard this before. And I guess it is something to kind of keep in mind, especially when you interact with creatives, because there might be personality traits that when you interact with them, you're kind of like, that person's a bit strange. But then, they're actually creative, and that's why they might behave a bit differently, I guess.
Right. Now, again, but it's also important to repeat that if you're too far on those dimensions, that's not so good.
Yeah.
Because it becomes dysfunctional at that point. So there's a sweet spot there.
Yeah, exactly. The sweet spot. How do we get to that sweet spot? How do we find it, Yeah.
Well, that's before, as we say in the U.S., that's the $64,000 question.
I don't get that reference, but sure.
Yeah, okay. That's that goes back to some game show. It's like the big rhetorical question that you really can't answer.
Interesting.
No one really knows the answer to, but it's an important question. Who else will use that phrase?
Okay.
64,000
question. $64,000. Okay. Something new to learn today as well, besides the fact that there's so much more to go into creativity and, finding that sweet spot of those personality traits. That is maybe some people will start attempting to do that, after this. I don't know. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see the reaction of everyday people when they start hearing more and more messages like this when it comes to creativity. I guess we've mentioned this before, but I want to circle back to it a little bit just so we can close out that area where we talk about, creative versus artistic, like those are two different things. And I guess what you were saying before is creative includes artistic, but it doesn't mean that it's the only thing. Artistic is not the only way to be creative. And another thing that we've noticed as well in our research, looking into your work, and you've mentioned this before, is there would be a high degree of creativity involved in other science, right? Like, physical science. So I guess there's got to be a difference there, the difference between artists and scientists in terms of creativity. How can we identify that difference, and how can we identify that within ourselves?
Right. So, and I've definitely thought about this over the years, and I have a relatively straightforward answer, I think, which again involves first making a distinction.
Yeah.
And here the distinction first is between at least two basic phases or stages of the creative process. There's the idea generation stage, where you actually generate ideas. And then there's a selection and an evaluation of those ideas. So as a writer, you can think about it, it's the composition versus editing phases. You're just getting out ideas as when you're composing, and then you have to go through and edit and select and refine and change and, evaluate. So all creativity really has those two phases, whether you're in art or science. And I think, so the simple answer is that the first phase is essentially the same, to be honest, in art and science for the most part. The idea generation, it's kind of intuitive, it's broad, it's open, it's wide, it's a hunch, it's thinking outside the box, having inspiration, coming up with an idea. So that's not that different, I don't think, really, in the arts and sciences. But what's different is the second part, the second phase is what an artist, whether they're a writer, musician, painter, dancer, whatever, sculptor, what they do when they're having their ideas and how they're going through that process of selecting and modifying and editing and changing and deciding for this versus that. It's a different process, and it is a little bit more fluid and intuitive for a lot of artists, I think.
Yeah.
So they kind of keep that more free-flowing, intuitive, like you just have a sense of this is right. You stop the painting when it's right, and you can't say what that is. Whereas in science, of course, once you have an idea, that's where the hard part begins, because now you have to design a study around and to answer that question that you've now have an idea about or whatever. And so the scientific method is a pretty systematic process, So you develop hypotheses, you have some kind of measurement, and reliable and valid measures of whatever it is you're trying to study. You design a study, you collect data, you analyze the data, and you write it up. So that's a very different second part to that. It's more prescripted. It's more determined by the kind of the scientific process. Whereas art is the way artists, and again, I'm talking about art in general, but of course there's differences between writers and painters or musicians. Like a writer very much is often, they have an outline of an idea maybe, and then they discover what they're really thinking in the process of writing. And then sometimes they'll realize halfway through that, oh no, this sucks. And they'll change things completely or whatever. That happens in science too. So the simple answer is that the first part, the idea generation, is very similar. But the second part, selecting and evaluating the ideas, is pretty different between the arts and sciences. So that's my answer.
Yeah. Selecting and analyzing. Wow. Okay. There's something new there for sure. Because I guess when I saw the question myself, I was kind of like, I wonder what it is. What differentiates the creativity between artists and scientists, even though they are both creative, and then now that you've kind of unpacked it, I'm like, oh, I see. There's got to be more thinking here. It's not something to pick up straight away.
And then one other thing I'll say just very briefly about that, though, too, is and this is also, again, something I'm developing in my book, which is that I think that the thing that most artists are trying to make meaning of is their own internal experiences, often emotional, often it could be traumatic, it could be not, it could just be an experience they had as a younger person and they're just trying to express in their art or whatever. So some internal state, whereas scientists are trying to make meaning by understanding often the outside world rather than the inside world. So I think that's another difference between the arts and sciences.
Yeah.
So definitely the physical sciences, especially, because that's what makes, so the way I think about science is in three broad strokes in categories. If you study things, you're a physical scientist, like compounds and chemicals and stars and planets and rocks. If you study living things, you're some kind of life biological scientist, plants and animals. And then if you study humans, you're some kind of social scientist. So you're trying to understand those things outside of yourself, typically. Now, psychology is kind of weird because psychology is both outside and inside.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
But you're curious about that, and you're trying to make sense of the outside world.
Yeah.
Whereas again, artists are often trying to make sense of their interpretation, their internal interpretation of the world, are their experiences, are their emotions.
Yeah.
And that's, by the way, one reason I think that, you know, and some of my research has found this too, which is that like Jameson, like some really creative artists, especially performance and expressive artists, are more prone to mood disorders. But then they're doing something creative with it. I mean, that's the way we're talking about a minute ago.
Yeah.
So that's what makes them creative. I mean, a lot of people are anxious and depressed.
Yeah.
But only some people do something creative with that.
That is so true.
You know.
Yeah. I can confirm that. Yeah. Even when I was going through anxiety, depression, nothing autistic came out of that. So I could kind of sense and see, okay, got it. But yeah, I agree with you. I've noticed a lot of artists that kind of, you know, speak openly about the process of them overcoming certain things, and then they produce something so beautiful out of that, which is incredible.
Right. Well, I mean, think about what most songs are about. Most songs are about love and death and loss and breakup and sadness and loneliness and, you know, all those negative moods that we all go through.
Yeah.
But some people find inspiration in that, and that's their way of coping with it, really.
Yeah, that is so true. I wonder how many breakup songs are there compared to, you know, non-breakup songs.
Not a billion.
Yeah. The ratio, you know, maybe this can go into your research, you know, the ratio would say how these things come to life, you know, especially in songs and in poems and other things. Like, it's so interesting. You know, I really enjoyed this conversation, and I have to say, we can go on all night. You know, it's already afternoon here. We'll go into the night, and it's night for you. Could go till tomorrow. But I think I really want to now get our audience to get something practical that they can take away from our conversation. We've had all the research insights. We found that you're also working on a book, but I wonder for yourself, you know, you're teaching, you're studying this, you're writing books about it. What is something that you do for yourself to cultivate your own creativity?
Well, you know, I was thinking about this, and, you know, this is going to sound kind of weird in a way, but one of the things I do and enjoy the most is long distance biking. You know, what I mean by long distance is, you know, anywhere from 20 to 50 miles typically.
Yeah.
You know, so out for a couple hours on the bike, and I go up we live right next to the hills, you know, in Berkeley, Oakland is where I live. And so what I really enjoy about that is that it's just time to reflect and have my mind wander, let my mind wander while I'm doing hard physical exercise, especially going up the mountains. I can't say how many times I've had my best ideas on the bike. Because I'm not thinking about anything. I'm not focused. I'm just letting my mind wander, and I'm just doing, you know, physical exercise. It's getting the heart rate up and so on. And we now know that actually I don't do this research, but I've definitely read it. It's called, there's a part of your brain called the default mode network. And it literally is a brain, it's a cluster of brain regions, really. And it's called the default mode network is because it becomes active when you're not focused on anything in particular. You're literally like, you're not trying to solve a problem. You're not paying attention to any one thing. You're just letting your mind wander. And we now know that that's also very important in the creative process, is that you have to work into your life time to let your mind wander. Don't focus, put your phone down, turn it off. Don't do anything other than walk, ride a bike, read, you know, contemplate, listen to relaxing music, whatever, but just let your mind wander. And as it turns out, you know, and especially, and gets back to this point we were saying earlier, one of the biggest problems with social media and technology is that, and one reason I think people who get obsessed with it and addicted to it really are unhappy and anxious and depressed, besides the social comparison thing, is that they never have a downtime. They're constantly feeding themselves with basically junk for the most part. Yeah. You know, and they're not letting their mind just do what it needs to do, is relax and just not focus on anything for a while.
Yeah.
And so that's what I do. For me, it's personally, it's hiking or biking are the two things I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear. And I think for this generation, our current generation, my generation, it's been a bit tougher. And yeah, you're right.
Sure. Right.
Our generation doesn't have as much downtime ever
Right.
because somehow we choose not to. We could drop the phone and go out for a walk, but instead we're kind of like,
Right. Or
there's
even
something.
afraid of. I mean, by the way, this is something that I'll say is that really creative people don't mind solitude. In fact, they actually need solitude.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Because you can't always be doing something. You need to reflect. You need to think. You need to ponder. You need to just let your mind do. And so like write a journal or something. Some people do that. Keep it. But if you're constantly being fed stimulation, and you're never having downtime, you're kind of asking for kind of a chaotic mind and a chaotic.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
And what some people do, I don't, but some people definitely meditate. I've always said that biking and hiking are my meditations.
Yeah.
You just need to do something like that, though.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a walk in nature would be nice. I do meditate, but I think being able to combine that with a physical activity would be really good, especially because it gives you time to think.
And doing it regularly.
Yeah, and space. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right,
away from all the screens. That would be really nice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said hiking and biking, which are very like active, habits that you're doing. I wonder for you personally, you've said that it helps you to have downtime and to have space to think. But what are some other key benefits that you get from it?
Well, I mean, the thing about, aerobic exercises, which I do, and I've always been active. I was an athlete when I was a young kid and I was a bike messenger in Boston for a year. So I've always done that. And my dad also was an athlete and athletic and active, as well as a professor. So I kind of follow after him there as well. But I just think that, obviously, as it turns out, it relaxes you. And we now know that aerobic exercise is really good for the brain, not just the body. It literally is good for the brain. It facilitates what we call neurogenesis, the growth of neurons, which is necessary for a healthy brain. And young people have more neurogenesis than older people, and I'm getting older, so want to keep that. And it really is. There is actually research showing that regular aerobic exercise is, again, not only good for your body, but it actually also, people who engage in that are, there's no cure for dementia and so on, but it does keep cognitive activity going more and stave off anyway, the gradual cognitive decline that I guess we all pretty much end up experiencing to a larger or greater extent. But I mean, keeping that aerobic, because it's blood flow in the brain, and that's how the brain works. So by doing that regularly, you really are facilitating, your brain too, not just your body.
Yeah. Wow, absolutely incredible to hear that. Those benefits are urging me to go out for a walk right now, because I would like to, like make sure my brain's okay and well, and migrated assets.
Well,
definitely.
And especially as we all age, even if you're young, hopefully that's
absolutely
you'll
important.
Get more.
It's important for everyone, truly. I totally agree. So I think you said that you're definitely on the active side. You're very active in your lives, but are there challenges? What are some of the challenges when you do this regularly? Are there things that are stopping you from doing it from time to time, or maybe some things that might make you skip it every now and again?
Right. Well, life.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, I have two kids. They're now out. I'm an empty nester, so that's opened up some space. But especially when I was a younger parent, it's like I didn't have as much time, but I always tried to make sure that I still had at least 1 or 2 rides a week, that I would just kind of force myself to do, because it is hard.
Yeah.
And you don't always feel like it. But I've been doing it so long now where it's just like I just kind of have to do it. And I have friends who go out like every day, and it's like, okay, I can't do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's just hard to sometimes fit it into your life, but you just have to make it a routine.
Yeah.
And like, even if it's just walking, walking is easy. Everyone can do it, really.
Yeah.
Or not, even if you can't, even if you're in a wheelchair, you can still go out and go in your chair or whatever. I mean, anyone can go out and do things. So I think that's important, but it's not always easy to fit it into, especially I'm pretty busy. I have a lot going on. It'd be easy not to, if I really wanted to.
Yeah,
but
for sure. Yeah, but I guess, it's, as you mentioned earlier, it's so important to you because it's, it's something that you value. You need to do that, not just for the, physical health benefit, mental health benefit, but so much more. And I guess because this show is about happiness, how do you find that in terms of improving, or maybe its effect when you biking and hiking regularly? How does that impact on your perception in life and level of happiness?
I mean, again, I can say this both subjectively and also knowing the science behind it is, it's some of the best stress releasers there is.
Yeah.
Physical aerobic exercise, but exercise in general definitely is very good for stress reduction. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
You can't. And actually, because I've definitely been on rides and been out doing exercise where I've been going through a really horrible time in my life or whatever, and I'm pissed and I'm angry and whatever, but that's good. It actually gets that out. Because you're doing all this, your heart rate's up, you're doing things, and it's a release.
Yeah.
And then you come back and you're just like, okay, got that out of my system.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So it has a lot of benefits.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying anything new. Everyone knows this. I'm not trying.
Exactly. But still, it's good to hear from people who actually do these things, because it's easy to kind of go and read a paper saying, here are the benefits of so and so. But then, here's Gregory hiking and biking regularly and, feeling that like you're improving your physical health, mental health, and de-stressing.
Emotional health.
De-stressing from whatever it is that might be happening. And I guess that's relatable. It's super relatable, and it helps to remind us, everyone does that. It's just each person has a very different way of doing things. And in this scenario, it helps you with your creativity too, which is beyond awesome. So I think that's great. And the final question I want to ask you about this practice is, if anyone would like to take up a similar practice, would you recommend them to combine this with something else so that they can boost their creativity even further?
Well, yeah. I mean, the main thing I would recommend is whatever activity it is, and it doesn't even have to be physical. I mean, that's my solution, but it has to be. Has to be. I don't want to say anything. Anyone has to do anything in life, but if you really want to help your well-being, is do something to let your mind wander, whatever it is. I mean, like, this is one reason why ideas come in the shower, because you're not thinking about anything. You're just reflecting. You're just letting your mind go. Or, again, for some people it might be meditating, listening to relaxing music, whatever it is. But it has to be kind of downtime, where you literally do let your mind just go wherever it goes for a while, and be okay with that, and actually even seek it out.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds great. I want to do that. After this, I'm gonna.
Well, I mean, are you? I don't know how far you are from the beach, but
not that far away. It's a tram ride away, but I think we have the harbor right here, and that's nice. That's also nice. And I guess this is something that we can all try in our different ways, depending on where we are. We can, always find a nice place, nature, anywhere to start doing things that help us.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that too. In fact, tomorrow I'm headed up. I have a cabin in the Sierra Mountains, and I'm going there tomorrow. And that's one of my my other things too. I just need to get away from, because I live in the San Francisco Bay Area is like 8 million people. It's pretty, which I enjoy on some level, but I need to get away pretty regularly too. And so that's,
Yeah.
you know,
Sounds like Melbourne to me as well. Yeah. Yeah, not as big as where you are, but I can relate to that for sure. It's good to get away sometimes.
right.
That is really good to hear, from your perspective as someone who is creative in your own senses and your own rights. You're very creative. You've done a lot of work in writing and publications. You're doing even more writing now. You're teaching, and I think it is inspiring for our audience just to hear and to start taking up some of these things that maybe they've forgotten about or they've been meaning to do. Physical activity, which will help them actually to boost their creativity and in turn boost their happiness. Now, we also have some questions from our audience, which I
Okay.
find to be interesting. A lot of the questions are repeat from what you already mentioned, but in particular, I find this one question that is particular to a target audience, and I'm keen to find out because my grandpa is turning 100. So I would like to ask.
Wow.
Yeah, I would like to ask
Congratulations.
this question. Thank you. On behalf of the audience and myself, what are the ways to improve creativity for the elderly that will eventually help to boost happiness?
Well, so that's something we didn't even really get into too much, but um, yeah. So this for really rather well-known psychologist named Eric Erickson had a very broad theory and idea of how personality develops, and so he talked about in adulthood and old age, especially adulthood, there's what he calls generativity, and it's just generating, producing ideas, people, like literally having children, or then older, and then when you're being creative in a broad sense with your life, but then also when you get older, keeping your mind active, solving problems, thinking, doing, that's why, there's a lot, there is something to the fact that if you do cognitive activity regularly, whether it's even just reading or thinking or solving problems, word problems or whatever on a daily basis, it does keep your mind sharper. Again, there's a fair amount of research on that. Now it can be oversold to some extent, but there's something to that. Because, especially as you age, there definitely are things that happen to even the healthiest people. But like I know someone, one of my good friends, his mom is 96 and she's still very sharp. And I have another friend whose mom is actually a world famous actress, Rita Moreno, and she's 90 and she's as sharp as can be,
Wow, that's
Now, some of that's
amazing.
genetic, some of it's just luck to some extent, to be honest. But what they all have in common is they stay really active, both physically and mentally, instead of just, and it's important as you age, I think, to do that because again, it facilitates brain flow, blood flow in the brain and other things. And so just keeping that mind going, brain going, really. Yeah. So, and, in doing crafts, I mean, sometimes a lot of people, especially as they age, they do crafts. They whatever make, around the house they can, or cook, I like to cook too, and just doing things that are, simple and productive.
Yeah.
Or do woodworking. I also like to do that, build stuff around the house.
Yeah.
Just so all of those kinds of activities I think are
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. Those are really good tips. I'm visiting my family soon, so I'm gonna maybe give Grandpa new books. He loves reading. He used to be a professor himself. He used to write a
Wow.
lot of things, articles and things like that. He stopped, I think, when he turned 90. But yeah,
Wow.
I'll give him puzzles and books.
He stopped writing his own
Yeah,
stuff at
yeah. He
9.
stopped writing his
Oh,
publications. He published 2 collections of poems. Just based on his life experiences, because he's seen the war, and it's been like a really it's very
wow.
interesting life journey for him. And yeah, he published that for our family only. It's not like for on sale or anything, but yeah, it's amazing to see. And
Well, I
still
mean, if you
write things.
that's the thing. If you make it to 100, you almost certainly are really pretty
Yeah.
healthy, because otherwise, the things that kill people are the things, that
Yeah.
kill people in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah,
And if you make
actually, that's right. You just reminded me because he still writes poems, but not for like a particular purpose. But for example, for my birthday, he wrote me a poem.
oh,
Yeah, like that's his love language, and that's
wow,
his creativity, and that boosts his happiness.
right.
And I guess that's why he's still going strong with us, and
Yep.
yeah, very proud of
Yeah.
grandpa, and happy
Yeah.
that
Well, you should,
he's applying the
should be.
principle. You know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's all we can ever hope for is
Yeah, absolutely.
living a long, healthy life, and
Yeah.
doesn't get much older than 100. So,
Mm-mm.
and,
Yeah.
and, and still with it.
Yeah.
Uh,
I'm relating
yeah.
all
Good
of
for
your
you.
insights to grandpa because I think that now everything makes sense. Definitely making sense now. Great. So thank
But
you so much for that. I think it was a really great question, especially for another target audience that we don't talk about very
yeah.
often, which is
Well,
the elderly. It's good to touch on that for sure. And we will all become old one day if we're not already old. And it's
that's,
good to keep that in mind.
as they say, it beats the alternative. Either you
Exactly.
get old or you don't.
Yeah, exactly, for sure. So thank you for all of those insights. And finally, this is the section that I've been waiting for because I know you're very passionate about psychology, creativity, personality, but I wonder, you must have other things that you're passionate about. Like I think every single person has something that's kind of like a quirk or something that they're passionate about they don't talk about very often. And for this section, open mic, we always invite our guests to talk about things that they haven't had the chance to mention on any other platforms or things that they are really passionate about, but the chance just hasn't come for them to speak about it. So what would that be for you?
Well, for me, and I actually did kind of tease it and mention it, and I won't have time to go into it, but I wrote this book on the psychology of science and the origin of the scientific mind about 15, 20 years ago. And I really got into evolution. I really became amazed by, we forget that we're a weird species. Okay.
Yeah.
And we're weird because we're the only species of the genus Homo, whereas every other animal on the planet has many different species, and we used to. So what I find fascinating is how we came to be and how our minds came to be. And so I read a lot about human cognitive evolution. And I think broad because I started off in philosophy. So that's that book that I'm working on, which is the first part of it is the evolved mind and how the mind came to try to make sense of things. Literally, like even in the first brains that ever existed 450 million years ago on the planet, they could sense their environment. That's what a brain really is. And so sensing the environment is also the first step to making sense. Like what's out there, and you have to have some kind of sensory system. So I'm really getting into the idea of how did we get here? How did our brains get here? And then, because ultimately what our brain really does is it keeps us alive, but it also is making sense of all of our sensory experience. And then ultimately, and then again, creativity is kind of one outcome of all that. So I don't know if that's maybe too on target, be that different. But it is an evolutionary perspective of the human brain and the human mind.
Yeah.
And I think that creativity is ultimately kind of just one way of doing what the brain does, which is make sense of everything that we see, smell, taste, hear, and feel.
Yeah.
Through our senses.
Yeah. Incredible.
And some people like to create their own meaning, their own creative meaning, and other people like to just accept cultural meaning.
Yeah.
Like just accept what, the ideas that other people have already come up with. And,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, I think it's on point because now that you've mentioned this in our open mic, it sounds to me like you're just so connected and passionate about your work. And that is, beautiful. We should all be doing that, because I feel like that is just a true testament to your level of happiness. It shows that you're connected to your work, you're passionate about it, and in turn, you show that happiness when you talk about it. Your eyes kind of twinkling. It's beautiful, really nice to see. And we should all have that in our lives, whatever it is that we're talking about. For example, I'm passionate about, I don't know, running, let's say.
Right.
And I'm so passionate when I'm talking about it. And, it inspires other people. And so I think this is very, very on point. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about teaching, is that I get to share my excitement with learning and understanding and thinking and again, yeah, I mean, because it is exciting, because this is what our brains are meant to do, is figure things out, and we might as well make use of them.
Yeah. Great message to end this episode. Thank you so much. I guess I will probably have to listen to it again, because there's been so much that you mentioned that I was kind of like, in the conversation, I was like, yes,
right,
yes, oh yes, but I forgot. Okay, I need to circle back and maybe listen to that again. So yeah, thank you so much for your time. This has been so great. And finally, where can our listener find out more about you if they want to follow your work and subscribe to your book that's coming out?
Well, I mean, so the easiest thing to do, I there's a Wikipedia page I have, but you can always just go to San Jose State's Psychology Department webpage and find my own webpage there. I have my own professional webpage there, and so there's some links to stuff I've done and some of my papers and some of my research topics and what I do. So that's probably the easiest way to do it. San Jose State. Here in California.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm sure after this, a lot of people will start following you to learn more about all of the things that you're doing research into and writing about. So thank you. And thanks again for being here.
This was great. I'm glad, I always like it when people are interested in the things that I'm interested in.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Me too. Yeah. Right. You get really nerdy when you talk about things you're interested in. And, if someone kind of responds to that, you just kind of like, yes, thank you.
I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah,
exactly.
Good. Well, thank you for inviting me. This has been a lot of fun. Yeah. I'm glad we had this chance to talk about these things.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. You've been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast, produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.